The palette that I'm using today is just primaries in watercolor. So specifically, I'm using Permanent Rose as my red, Winsor Yellow as my yellow, and Winsor Blue. These are all from Winsor Newton Studios, and I absolutely love their watercolors. Well, really all their products. To start this morning, Dev, I'm going to work on building my gray palette. The amazing thing about these birds is they're actually full of color. Even though at first glance they predominantly just look gray, all of these different grays have different undertones. We're seeing lots of blues and purples and ochres and warmth and coolness. So there's so much to play with just these three colors. And honestly, I have more than enough to build all the colors I need for a full palette just from my primaries. And it's a fun exercise that I learned to do after taking a class with an amazing watercolor instructor. Her name's Jeannie Vodden. And though our painting techniques are very different, she first introduced me to this method of playing with primaries and bleeding them into each other. Though her work is beautiful and loose and vibrant, and mine is much more neutral, she broke me out of trying to micromanage my pigments too much and just allowing them to organically bleed together as you should with watercolor. That's the most amazing thing about the medium, is they blend beautifully. So why not use that to your advantage in your painting? I still paint very tight and very small, as you can see with a lot of these details, but that's also quite a bit of my style. Is I do paint really tight. I'm working with my oils to really branch out and do bigger strokes and chunkier strokes and see more brush strokes. But when it comes to watercolor, I'm very used to working this small and tight, and even the looseness that there is in this piece, which frankly doesn't look like much, it's much looser than I used to paint watercolors. So as you can see, I'm starting to develop my different hues of gray. On the top part of the wing, we're seeing more of a bluish, cool gray, so that Winsor blue is playing a large role in bringing in that royal cobalt kind of tone up there, while still being soft and muted. Here I'm adding water just to the paper, no pigment, and then I'm going to come back on top with pigment, and it's just going to kind of bleed into that space a little bit. It's called painting wet on wet. It's not a technique that I use a lot, but I'm learning to use it more to my advantage and use it in my toolkit, because I really do want to honor the watercolor medium, and painting wet on wet is a big part of that. I kind of temper that with painting wet on dry, which is where I will bring in my details. And the wet on wet method works well if you get to it super, super quick. So you lay down your water on your paper first, and then you immediately come in with pigment, and then you blend it out and kind of let it do what it's going to do. And the pigment that you lay down is going to rest wherever you put your water. Kind of like a primer, kind of like a primer on paper. But when I'm going to go do my details, I really like to work wet on dry, meaning just pigment on dry paper. And that's because the pigment won't bleed as much. And for my details, I don't want any bleeding. I want them to be as precise as possible. For going in and doing the details on these wings, I'm really just putting in a base right now of what my different grays are. And we're going to build on this pretty considerably. Especially with watercolors, you need to come in with, if you want rich pigment, you got to come in time and time again in order to get the color density that you want. I already paint pretty heavy-handed with my watercolors later on, not for these first steps of base coating, but as I start building, I will wet my brush considerably less and go for picking up substantially more pigment in order to get a deeper color density. Similarly to the color of the top of that wing that's in the forefront and the color of the gray that's on the dove's back, they're both pretty blue. So first I laid down a blue base, and then I'm going back on top. And when I say blue base, it's still a gray, but it's just a tiny, tiny touch of blue. Now I'm going in and adding some more feather details. I will continue to go back and lay a base color, do a wash of base color, lay on some more details. You can see me fiddling off in the corner, trying to check my reference, zooming in on it, zooming out of it, trying to look at it from a whole bunch of different perspectives. Sometimes what I'll also do is while I'm working, I will take a picture of my painting and just examine that so I can see in a different perspective how it's reading. And that will often help me reevaluate the direction that I'm going. Sometimes something will look fantastic in person and I'll capture it and I'll look at it on a screen, on a much smaller screen where everything is condensed, and I'll notice that something isn't reading as well. I wasn't really worried about this before Instagram days, but the blessing and the curse of needing to be on social media and being an artist who's trying to grow their platform, I need to make sure that my images look as clean and as accurate as they can on both a really big screen and a mobile phone screen. So stepping back and taking pictures to reevaluate what I'm working with helps a lot. I worked on this bird over the course of, I want to say, about 4 days. So you'll see some jumps in the video of, a little section being done that maybe I didn't record. And honestly, a lot of this was me working with new equipment that I haven't worked with before and having to stop and charge all the time and having to stop and unload my SD card a million times, and having to do that for my Canon and having to do that for my GoPro. So something else that you're probably seeing is that the painting footage is a bit different than my palette footage, and I promise it's gonna get better in time, but I did want to show a more real-time examination of my blending process, whereas with the painting of the bird, the time lapse, I'm not going to make you sit there and watch 4 hours of me painting a bird, though some might enjoy that, and maybe someday I'll work towards that. But I thought that the real-time palette painting, palette mixing was going to be more informative than a 4-hour tutorial on how to paint a mourning dove in primaries. So thank you for sticking with me. I'm going to continue to block out these wings by practicing the wet on wet technique of laying down water first onto the paper and then coming in with my grays. These wings are mostly a bluish gray, still focusing on that Winsor blue to play an active part. It will become more evident as I continue to layer colors, because this is really just our base that we're going to work with. And I just want to lay down my shadows and block out my highlights. With watercolor, it's really difficult to go in with white on top of areas that you want to be white. So really you need to negative paint them. Some people will put masking down, which I've done before. Masking fluid is a really neat, weird glue-like medium that you put down and it dries, and then you can paint on top of it, and then you can peel it off, and that preserves your white. Sometimes I have success with it, sometimes I don't. Sometimes I don't have the patience for it, and I'll just negative paint around it because I'm pretty used to doing that. It just depends on the day and on the subject. So with this guy, I didn't use any masking fluid. I just negative painted around all of my highlights. That's why you can see me working really tirelessly to not put pigment in areas that are still going to be whitish in the end. I will always do a light wash of pigment, even over the areas that are my highlights that are supposed to look quote unquote white. I really never leave just straight paper. I'll still wash it with maybe my lightest gray, my lightest ochre, because that makes it feel a bit more organic. Rarely are you going to see something in a painting, especially watercolor painting, that is just pure paper white, sometimes it just, I don't know why, it doesn't seem to translate as organic. So I'll always do like a light wash of color, even over my whitest whites, to make it feel more cohesive. Working on this back wing, I noticed that in the reference, feathers that are farther away from us are much more blue and vibrant in tone. And I think that that's because we're seeing a different perspective of the wing. We're really seeing the outside of the wing, which I loved in comparison to the wing that's closest to us, the one in the foreground, where we're seeing the underside of the wing. So those tones are going to be very different. They're still, when we get down to it, they're still all pretty much gray, but I wanted there to be more blue and more purple hues to this top side of this back wing that we're working on. Once again, I'm just working on color blocking, preserving my highlights, drawing in a bit of my shadows. I will go in later and add the depths to my shadows, and I will do that over and over and over again. You'll find that when you're working with watercolors, you'll lay down the pigment that you're looking for. You'll put it down and you're like, this is fantastic. This is the color. This is the depth that I want. And then you'll come back a couple hours later, even 10 minutes later when it's dry, and you go, where'd my pigment go? And it's just because it's settling into the paper a bit. So you can go over it a million times until it's really as dark as you want to go. And when I'm working to get my deepest, almost black tones, I will probably paint over that 5 times, 6 times, just depends on how deep I'm trying to go with that pigment. In order to get these blue, purple, gray tones, what I'm really doing first is I'm taking my permanent rose, which is my red, and I'm mixing it initially with my Winsor yellow, and I'm making a orange, and then I'll bring in the blue. And bringing in the blue to that mixture is going to muddy it. And by muddying it, it means it's going to turn it into this not really defined color, aka gray, which is what we're working with for the whole palette. And then if you're looking to get more of a blue tone, you bring in a little bit of your Winsor blue, and you want to warm it up, we can come back in with a little bit of the Winsor yellow and just play and push and pull that color. Hence why you can see in my palette, I don't have a really defined space for all my different grays. I'm happy for them to all bleed together in my palette because I'm kind of pushing the blue gray a bit more, and then I'm pulling out some warmth. And I like to see them all mixed together in my palette because then I can jump in and take those midtones and fill them in where I need to fill in. Now I'm going to come in and start basing out the tail. Basing out the tail is not a pretty process. It really just looks like throwing down some gray washes, and ultimately that's kind of what I'm doing. This is when I have to pep talk myself quite a bit, and I can't stop in the middle of this process and then come back the next day because I will think to myself, what am I doing with my life? So I really have to sit down and just start slamming in color, especially to these big blocks like this, where at first it's just going to look gray. It's going to look like incomplete gray masses. And I just have to remind myself that we're going to come in with detail and we're going to come in with feathering, and it's going to be fine. We're just laying a foundation. My favorite part is coming in with shadows. With watercolor, if we want to be academic about it, you ultimately want to go from building your lightest color and gradually building that up to your darkest color. However, I am kind of a erratic painter. I wouldn't consider myself academic at all. I'm going to claim that as my style, trademark, maybe, we'll see. And I'll lay my foundation. I'll preserve a bit of my highlights and shadows, and then I really want to immediately jump in with my shadows because it's going to help me determine what my midtones are going to be. And I feel like the realness of your subject comes from what your midtones are. And I'm sure someone could argue that with me, that maybe it's your highlights and your depth of shadows that really drive home your subject and the realness of it. But for me, I find that my magic happens after I've laid my highlights and I've laid my shadows, and I get to play in the space in between. And that is the most nerve-wracking place, but kind of fun, because it feels like a dance where once again you get to push and pull pigment, and you'll go in really, really light and just say, screw it, we're going all in. And maybe we throw in some deeper highlights there, but that middle ground of after you've laid your foundation and you get to come in and play with all those details, that's such a fun place, especially with watercolor, because it's really high risk. It's very difficult to take back pigment once it's been laid. Yes, you can take your brush, dip it in water, come back on top of your subject and kind of back it off and then dab it with paper towel. Don't cringe at me for doing that. Sometimes you got to do what you got to do. But really, ultimately, if you've laid down pigment, that's kind of where it's going to be. So if while you're playing with building your midtones and you went too dark on something, there have been times where I have just scrapped a whole 20, 30-hour watercolor painting because I messed up. And you really can't go back with watercolor. So it's a high risk, high reward kind of game. And I suppose I'm a masochist and I keep coming back to it, even though I've recently discovered that I do love oils. And with oils, you can just play and play and play and go back and forth and build it up and take it down. But with watercolors, you've got one shot. And I love that. I've always loved that. So I do have to temper going back and forth between all my different mediums to just keep that part of my brain sharp, because I find if I do too many watercolors, my brain will go to goo. And if I do too many oils, I get a little cocky, and then I come back to my watercolors and realize I don't know how to paint anymore. So it's important for me to constantly go back and forth. And I love exploring all these different mediums for that exact purpose. These tail feathers here really did kind of send me for a doozy, because at the end of the day, I know what feathers look like and I know how feathers lay on top of each other. But when I'm examining this particular bird and the angle that we're looking at and just how the feathers are laying, it didn't feel natural while I was painting it. It felt like I was kind of forcing something. So once again, that pep talk mentality kind of comes into play. It's like, okay, it's like we're gonna paint the subject that we have. I will make minor modifications along the way, but really this is the angle that we're working with. This is the lighting that we're working with, and I have to #trust the process, because it is a real freaking process with watercolor. And I've been painting with watercolor, oh my goodness, since I could physically hold a brush. I really learned to dive into it more as a young adolescent. I would go do these amazing watercolor classes with my aunt, and we would go into the Santa Cruz Mountains and rent cabins, and we would paint all morning and afternoon and through the evening. And it was just an incredible experience to be surrounded, especially at such a young age, by such incredible painters. And I think that is what really made me realize that I could absolutely sit down for the rest of my life and paint. And this is something that I really, really want to do. For years in college, I kind of took breaks here and there, big breaks, 6 months to a year breaks where I didn't paint, and I thought I was going to be fine. And I just always felt like something was missing. And it sounds really cheesy and cliche, but I look at things like they're paintings. When I drive down the highway, I look at the pigment in the bushes passing by, and I think about the colors I would mix to make those. I'm just wired this way. I don't know how to not sit down and paint. And I wouldn't say that I'm the greatest painter in the world, absolutely not, but I love the journey of just practice makes better. And I love sitting down and learning new things about myself and about the way my hand works with a brush and the way I look at color. And I'm so thankful to be surrounded by several friends and family who are also really accomplished, amazing artists and women. And they inspire me all the time to push my work and re-examine old pieces and pick apart my own work with an eye of scrutiny that sometimes feels terrifying, and I can fall under, the classification of being a perfectionist in my painting. But really at the end of the day, I'm not striving for hyperrealism. That's not my goal. I think that there are artists who do that fantastic. And I don't even want to devote my time and my practice to strive for hyperrealism. I already ride dressage. That's the area in my life that has to be perfect. I don't need my paintings to be that textbook. I just want them to be a reflection of me and a beautiful little devotion to whatever that subject is. And today, that's Mourning Doves. In 2020, as it was a horrible year for pretty much everybody, though granted, a lot of great things came out of it for me, there were days that I was struggling a lot. I was working at this barn, horse barn, and I was cleaning stalls, and I was just so thankful to be surrounded by horses again, because I wasn't sure if I was going to be. I moved to a new place. I moved completely across the state. I had never been here before, and I landed this job where I got to be around horses, which I've been around horses since pre-birth. So that's really my home. And on the days that I was just struggling with all the things in life that were going on, and all the things that were out of control, as we all experienced in 2020 and still a bit now in 2021, when I would just feel really incredibly down and like I had no sense of control and I just felt so downtrodden, every now and then these mourning doves would just perch right outside the stall I was working on. And they would just sit there just so peacefully, and we'd kind of look at one another, and that dove would just hang out with me for a little bit. And I would take a moment, and I'd stop cleaning stalls, and I would just take a couple second restful meditation and just look at how sweet these birds were. And I always felt like in my moments of struggling the most, they would come visit me. And ever since seeing them so closely last year, I knew I had to paint them. And I marveled at all the colors that they had in their feathers. It was just absolutely incredible. So I hope that with these sets of birds that I'm working on, that I can really honor all of the nuances that they have, and the softness and the strength and the vibrancy and the neutrality. It's just, they're so complex and lovely and delicate. They're just beautiful little things. I hope so much that you maybe got something from this little video of me painting and playing and talking and rambling as I do best, and I can't wait to see you for the next one. I have another mourning dove. This one's pair, he's got to have his buddy. So I'm working on his pair next, and I can't wait for you to see that one too. We'll be doing it in the same style, just primaries, red, yellow, and blue. And he's gonna be facing the other direction, a little different perspective, still playing with the same colors, but it's gonna be fun, and I can't wait for you to see it.